Welcome, everyone, to the Dharma Realm Buddhist University Symposium. We invite everyone to introduce themselves and share where you're joining us from on the chat. If you would you like to, we can see where our audience is from. I'm Sarah, and I am a faculty member at Dharma Realm Buddhist University in Ācārya, California. I'll be facilitating tonight's event. Tonight, we are honored to host Professor Mattia Salvini from the International Buddhist College in Thailand. Following Professor Salvini's talk, we will have about half an hour for questions and answers. And we invite you to write down your questions during the talk or afterwards, or raise your hand, and we'll do our best to facilitate. Before we begin, just a few words about tonight's venue and DRBU. The DRBU Symposium was established in 2015, and we host about 5 academic talks per year. Speakers from all around the world are invited to come and present lectures and workshops that are aimed to enhance our curriculum in the university and bring awareness to current scholarship and contemporary issues. We normally hold our events in person, but due to COVID, we've now moved to online for many of them. And Dharma Realm Buddhist University, for those of you who are new to us, is a small university offering a BA in liberal arts and an MA in Buddhist studies and practice, as well as a certificate in translation. And if you'd like more information, you can go to our website, which I'm posting in the chat, drbu.org. Now I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Dr. Sean Carr, who will introduce our speaker. Sean.
Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague to you, Dr. Mattia Salvini. Mattia has a very unique background. He did both his bachelor's and master's in Sanskrit in India, which has afforded him a traditional Sanskrit education that few scholars of Sanskrit in the Western Hemisphere have access to. And also, the depth of learning that comes with that. After his master's, Mattia did his PhD in the prestigious School of Oriental and African Studies in London, SOAS. And after that, he returned to South Asia, where he taught for many years at the Rangjung Yeshe Institute in Kathmandu, where he trained, among others, a number of the excellent future Berkeley Buddhist Studies PhD students, many of them the peers of Lauren and myself. One of them, Catherine Dalton, will be joining DRBU as a guest instructor for a session in the translation program this semester. Mattia went on to help build the International Buddhist Studies program at Mahidol University in Bangkok, Thailand. And he's currently the Dean of the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Dean of Scriptural Languages at the International Buddhist College Sadao campus in southern Thailand. Mattia has contributed to a number of classes already at DRBU with guest lectures and class visits, as well as providing really invaluable suggestions for our syllabus revisions and curricular development, particularly for our Shastra and Sanskrit classes. DRBU is, in fact, trying out his draft Sanskrit textbook this semester, which he's very kindly permitted us to make use of without any remuneration or, copyright concerns. Or, well, no, it is copyright, but out of the goodness of his heart. Mattia's research interests are Buddhist philosophy in Sanskrit language, and especially Madhyamaka, the relationship between Madhyamaka Yogacara and non-Mahayana Abhidharma, the relationship between philosophy and the Sanskrit science of Vyakarana, or grammar, which is also a philosophical treatise, Buddhist sutras, of course, as well as Buddhist lyric poetry. On a personal note, I can add that as a 21-year-old in India for the first time myself, I had the pleasure of getting an introduction to the very work that is the subject of the talk tonight, Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, with Mattia, when he himself was a first year's master's student. Even then, his learnedness was quite apparent, and those lessons made such a huge impression on me. They were a major formative influence, still stand out really vividly in my memory till this day. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Mattia Salvini for his talk tonight, Ācārya Prajñākaramati's verse of homage to the perfection of wisdom.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Sean, and to everyone in Dharma Buddhist University. Thank you for trying out my grammar, actually. That's very useful for me to know how it works out. Yes, today's talk is on just one verse, but as Sean kindly pointed out, I've also been reading this verse for more than 2 decades. And every time I read it, I realize that I missed something. And many of the things that I missed are things that I just saw this morning. So I was quite surprised to notice that I kind of woke up and saw, oh, I hadn't noticed that. And so I had to kind of put together a few notes and parallels that I think help understand this verse a little bit better. And I know some of you are studying the Bodhicharyavatara, so I hope that this will be a useful complement somehow. I also thought of using this verse because during this period we are having the Ratnakara readings, which are devoted to one of the, we can say, colleagues of the author of this verse, and one of his, not just colleagues, but in fact, philosophical opponents. So this seemed to be like a nice complement. As usual, perhaps I will start by just chanting the verse once. Ya nirlepataya niruttarapadam sarva prapanchojjita prajñāparamita samritipader ācārya nasrava yam samyak pratipadya nirmaladhiyo yanti uttamam nirvritim tam natva vidivat karomi vivrtim tasyah prasannehi padehi. Now, before I translate or I try to explain anything about this verse, I'm going to chant another verse, because I mentioned that there is something we can learn about this verse just taking into account its meter. And I think that you will immediately see some kind of resemblance by when you hear this other verse that I'm going to chant. Ya sarvajñataya nayatyupashamam shantyeshina shravakan ya margatñataya jagattita kritam lokarta sampadika sarvakaramidam vadanti munayo vishvam yaya sangatas tasya shravaka bodhisattva ganino buddhasya matre namaha. Now there's 2 typos here with shravaka and sarvakaram. This should not be there. Sorry, I copied it and didn't double check carefully. But I think you can hear probably that there is a similar rhythm. Both of these verses are in the same meter. And apart from that, you can also maybe see that there is a similarity of structure. Both of them begin with ya, for example, ya sarvajñataya, ya nirlepataya. So there's also a kind of syntactical similarity. But apart from the syntax, the main point is just the sound might bring back to mind that other verse. So perhaps let me start from that other verse so that you know why this similarity is significant. What is that other verse? Why would Prajñākaramati, the author of this verse, offer this echo? Well, the other verse is probably one of the most famous verses of Homage for the perfection of wisdom. It's the first verse of the Abhisamaya Alankara Karika, which is a text attributed in the Tibetan tradition to the future Buddha, Maitreya. And this text is an Upadesha, a series of instructions on the perfection of wisdom. And this verse praises the perfection of wisdom as being the mother of the Buddhas who are accompanied by the Shravakas and the Bodhisattvas. And this verse says that the perfection of wisdom is the one who brings the Shravakas who wish for peace to peace. The Shravakas means those who hear the Dharma and who make it heard to others. So it means those who are practicing towards liberation, Nirvana. Through her nature as omniscience, Sarvajñata, the perfection of wisdom brings the Shravakas, these hearers and proclaimers, to Nirvana. It means through the knowledge of the four truths. Sarvajñata, omniscience, in the context of the Abhisamaya Alankara and of the Prajñākaramati, doesn't always refer to the full-blown omniscience of a Buddha. It can just mean knowing everything that you need for the sake of liberation. And in that case, it is Sarvajñata and not Sarvakārajñata. The Sarvakārajñata means knowing everything in all its aspects. So in the case of the Shravakas, the Prajñākaramati manifests as knowing everything they need for liberation and brings them to liberation. Then, what is then that they lack? For the Bodhisattvas, the Prajñākaramati manifests as the knowledge of the path, Margajñata, which is the path of the six perfections, the two accumulations of merit and wisdom, which are going to result in Buddhahood. That path is not known to the Shravakas. So that is how the Prajñākaramati manifests for the Bodhisattvas on the path. Then the Prajñākaramati is the actual omniscience of the Buddhas. So it is by having that level of Prajñākaramati, the ultimate level of Prajñākaramati, that the Buddhas are able to explain everything in all its aspects. So the Prajñākaramati has a role, according to the tradition of the Abhisamaya Alankara, which reflects what we find in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, as a role in all the paths. All the Buddhist paths depend ultimately on the Prajñākaramati, according to this tradition. Now, the fact that we would have this echo, this strong echo of this verse in Prajñākaramati, I think is certainly not unintentional. I think it's quite intentional. And I think by somewhat mirroring the structure of this verse and some of its features, Prajñākaramati wants to point out that what he is going to explain is connected to this tradition of the Abhisamaya Alankara and the explanation, the instructions on the perfection of wisdom. Now, there is one another special feature of this particular Mangala-Ācārya, the verse that I read in the beginning by Prajñākaramati, can be regarded as an auspicious beginning. And this in itself is quite significant because normally the Mangala-Ācārya is at the beginning of a work. But in this case, we have a Mangala-Ācārya at the beginning of a chapter. So the Bodhicharyavatara has 10 chapters, and in this chapter on wisdom, we find that we have a new Mangala-Ācārya. So that suggests also to some extent that we can read this chapter somewhat independently, as a treatise, perhaps on the Prajñākaramati, and also as a Madhyamaka treatise. So this is one rather remarkable feature of the 9th chapter of the Bodhicharyavatara. I think that we can approach it from many different perspectives. We can see it within the context of outlining the whole Bodhisattva path in terms of the 6 perfections. As Prajñākaramati himself points out, it is also to be understood in the context of shamatha and vipassana, because the previous paramita, the previous perfection, is also representing the training in shamatha. And therefore, we find this particular progression as well included. So we can also consider it a chapter on vipassana, and this becomes quite perceptible when one gets to the sections on the placements of mindfulness, the 4 smritupasthanas, we actually find them. Also, we can think of it as treatise on Madhyamaka Darshana. So in the broader context of South Asian philosophy as a whole, we can see that Shantideva and Prajñākaramati both engage with non-Buddhist philosophy, of course, in a critical way. They have refutations of Sankhya and Nyaya position especially, but Prajñākaramati extend them to bear upon other systems such as Mimamsa, for example. So this particular chapter of the Bodhicharyavatara has all these different possible functions, which makes it a rather special and unique text. And deciding to place this Mangala-Ācārya here itself might have been a way for Prajñākaramati to show this very special feature of the chapter. As you know, this chapter is significantly long compared to other chapters, both in terms of the root text and the commentary. Prajñākaramati, he does, of course, extraordinarily well with the other chapters as well. So I disagree with some who have written that he doesn't seem so much invested in commenting on the other chapters. I feel that actually it's a wonderful commentary all around. But of course, when it comes to this chapter, it really shines in showing the Madhyamaka view. It's a very expanded presentation of Madhyamaka. At the same time, it happens to be a somewhat more accessible presentation when we compare it with the Mula Madhyamakarika or the Prasannapada, with which this is actually very closely connected. So I think there are many good reasons to spend a lot of time with the Bodhicharyavatara as a whole, but especially with the 9th chapter, which is also in some ways the most challenging. And Prajñākaramati, even just by the choice of meter, in a way, is advertising this fact that this chapter is really important. The Mangala-Ācārya actually is not just one verse. Now we're reading just one verse, but it continues. So if you read the more extended Mangala-Ācārya, you can see that he's really paying a lot of attention to this particular chapter. And even just the commentary to the first few verses could be considered in itself an introduction to Madhyamaka. Because while commenting on the first few verses, Madhyamaka is introduced by resorting to the standard subdivision of the two truths, Samvriti and Paramartha, the truth of the obscuration or of mutual arising or of conventions, and the truth which is the ultimate referent, the ultimate purpose, the ultimate meaning. These two truths are become the main way in which Madhyamaka is presented and introduced at the very beginning of the 9th chapter. These two truths also, I think, play a role in this Mangala Ācārya that we just read. And the way that becomes clearer is by paying close attention to the words which are used in the Sanskrit. Paradoxically, one of the words which is quite important, and this is one of the things I had not given much thought to until this morning, is really the word meaning word, pada. So this is a crucial term in this particular verse. This is of course, we should know it immediately because it appears 3 times. So just that should indicate that it is very important. Not only it appears 3 times, but its root appears even 1 more time, because we have samyak pratipadya. So why do we have this word pada and also its root appearing 1 more time in just 1 verse? I think this should always come to us as a kind of signal that, okay, there's something here that we have to pay attention to. So rather than starting from offering you the translation of the whole verse, we will go through the translation, but I want to start from a paradox. The paradox of the word pada. The paradox of the word pada, which we often translate as word, is that it can be derived, and it has been derived, from 2 different roots, which practically mean the opposite. So that, I think, is something quite striking if we think about it a little bit. So I think I wrote them down. Yes. So we have these 2 roots. The root pada, which is actually more frequently written with a ba, is one of the 2 roots from which we derive the word pada. And one of its meaning is Ācārya, which actually means like stability. The other root means movement. So the sound is the same. They are roots of different ganas. One, it should be the 1st gana, one the 4th gana, but they have the same sound, and both of them are used to explain the derivation of the word pada. So this word pada can be explained as padati or padyati, padyate. So in one case, it means being fixed and stable. In the other case, it means moving. And all the roots for movement also mean understanding. So this, of course, is quite important in the case of explaining why words perhaps are called pada. And also when we have a word like pratipadya, which sometimes would be translated as having understood. But you see, the problem that we have now is that it's very hard to reproduce these connections when we try to translate the verse. So we have these several terms which are actually the same exact sound or a similar sound in the case of Pratipadya. And this will immediately kind of ring a bell to a reader who's looking at the Sanskrit. But then when we have the English, it's lost. So for example, we have Niruttarapadam, the highest state, or Olmedo translates it as the station. That is Pada. Then we have Sambriti Padehi, covering words, conventional words. That is also Pada. And then we have Prasannehi Padehi, which means in clear words. But in fact, I think this is meant to be a very direct reference to the Prasannapada, the commentary by Chandrakirti. And in this way, we avoid also the Punarukti dosha somehow, because although we have the same term used, the same sounds, it's not used exactly in the same sense. So in fact, that is also a way for us to be aware that this word is not used exactly in the same sense. This word pada, which most naturally and maybe as the first meaning that comes to mind, we might understand as meaning word. In the first instance, it most likely means a state. And in the last instance, it does mean words, but in the context of also referring to a specific work by Chandrakirti, the Prasannapada. So by doing that, in fact, Prajñākaramati also has indicated his allegiance to a specific way of presenting Madhyamaka. And it is very clear throughout the commentary that Chandrakirti's presentation of Madhyamaka is his favored type of Madhyamaka. But he indicates it straight away. And actually, that is not the only word with which he indicates it. Now I'm going to show that there's another repetition, important repetition in the verse, which I think is rather remarkable if we try to really make sense of why this repetition. So we have, first it is said that which he's going to explain is usually expressed through sambrati padehi, through conventional words, such as Prajñākaramati, perfection of wisdom. So, in other words, here we have a paradox in a way, because, and this is a paradox of Madhyamaka in general, which I think is captured by this verse quite well. You will see that Prajñākaramati, among the three different ways of explaining the word sambrati, this word here, in Chandrakirti, we have three different ways of explaining the word sambrati. One is as something which covers. So sometimes it's translated as obscuration, and I have also translated it like that, but now I realize that it is somewhat wrong, because avarana can also be, you could use something transparent to do it, and there are cases where this is described. So covering is also difficult because we usually think of something like wrapping, and that is not necessarily the case. So actually the main idea is something like an all-around blockage, that I think if we want to go to what is really the basic idea of sambrati is an all-around blockage when it is interpreted in that way. The other way to understand the word is as mutual dependence, arising on the basis of mutual dependence, and therefore sambrati also has the sense of pratitya samutpada. In that sense is a perfect synonym of pratitya samutpada. Well, not perfect, but at least from the perspective of Madhyamaka, that is the most important way of looking at pratitya samutpada. So in that sense. And it can also mean sanketa, So Sanketa we can understand as a convention, a kind of agreement about a certain usage, when then the word Samvriti becomes a synonym of Vyavahara, so transactional usages, such as communicative usages. Among these three ways of approaching the word Samvriti, Prajñākaramati seems to favor the first one as the most important, at least in the context of presenting the two truths at the beginning of the Bodhicharya Avatar. So words, the main feature of these words is that they are, in a way, obscurations. They, or rather we could say, they block, they are complete blockade. The word Prajñāparamita, in some sense, blocks the realization of the Prajñāparamita. This is a kind of paradox of Madhyamaka thought, but I think that in this very verse we find some clues on how this paradox can be somewhat resolved. So the other word, not going in order, the other word that contains vritti is vivrati. Vivrati means an explanation, but it also means a disclosure, opening, removing the blockage. So how do we remove this blockage, which is actually a blockage which is in the very nature of words to produce? Well, he's going to do that through words, padehi. Which kind of words? Prasannehi padehi, clear words, and the words of Chandrakirti. So some words can be used in order to undo this obscuring or blocking quality that words have. And what is the purpose of that? Here we have another word with vritti, which is nirvriti. Nirvriti is practically a synonym of nirvana. So we also find parinirvriti, parinirvrita, etc., in the sense of having obtained nirvana. But if we go a little bit beyond the conventional usage, we can see this common etymology with samvriti, vivrati, nirvriti, and nirvriti could be understood as complete freedom from blockages, which is very much in line with the idea of Buddhahood, because Buddhahood is the freedom from the two types of blockages, the blockages which are the mental afflictions and the blockages that impede omniscience, so blockages to possible objects of awareness. So I think that this choice of words is very intentional to show us this paradox that he will actually address rather explicitly at one point in the commentary when someone asks actually, well, you say that the paramartha, or the nature of things, is not the scope of any kind of mind, and words by nature produce concepts. So how can you explain it? And he says, yeah, that's true, it's not possible. So the first answer he gives is, it's true, we cannot really explain it, but we can offer some kind of example. And then he offers an example, which is also in Chandrakirti, I believe, of someone with an eye problem, was some kind of optical illusion, and that person cannot really realize that it is an optical illusion, and that person might even try to remove the nets of hair or insect-like visions that are appearing to one's own vision. So if another person then sees that situation, the other person might go and say, you know, those nets of hair are not there. And this person is talking about nets of hair without having any imputation on one side about those nets of hair, but with the awareness that without speaking in that way, the other person will never realize that those nets of hair are not there. And this is the example of how Madhyamika philosophers use language. So even though this is to show that although strictly speaking, one cannot directly refer to the paramartha, to the ultimate meaning or to the nature of things, nevertheless, one can use words to remove certain conceptual superimpositions and make it possible for others to undergo the process that eventually will completely disclose the nature of things. So one of the, I think, important features of deciding to use a verse that brings to mind the Abhisamaya Alankara is perhaps to indicate that the realization of the perfection of wisdom is a process. And I think in that respect, we can better understand this verse by looking at a passage at the very beginning of Prajñākaramati's commentary, where he explains that Prajñākaramita is of two types. So there is a causal Prajñākaramita and a resultant Prajñākaramita. So this passage. So I'll just vaguely translate it to give some idea. Sattva prajñā dvividha. So that wisdom is of two types. Now there should be a space here. Hetu bhuta, phala bhuta cha. It existing as a cause and existing as a result. Hetu bhuta api dvividha. And the one which is causal Prajñākaramita also is of, or prajña, is of two types. Adimukti charitasya cha bhumi pravishtasya cha bodhisattvasya. Two types of bodhisattvas. Those who are still pratyajana, they're still practicing on the basis of firm conviction, adimukti, and those who have already entered the bodhisattva bhumis, the bodhisattva levels, the bodhisattva grounds, which means they are already Ācārya. Therefore, they already have a direct realization of the Prajñākaramita. So this causal Prajñākaramita already can be divided into two types, whether someone is a pratyajana or someone is an Ācārya. Phalabhuta, on the other hand, the one which is a resultant Prajñākaramita is sarvākara varupeta sarvadharma shunyatadikama svabhava animitta yogena. So I think this indicates the ultimate result. So it has the nature of being the realization of the emptiness of all the dharmas, and it is endowed with all the best aspects. This is an indication that we're talking about Buddhahood. And this is obtained through Animitta Yoga. Animitta Yoga means the yoga of no sign. I have to say that, again, we are encountering here a word which is extremely difficult to translate. Because yes, we can say the word nimitta means more or less sign, but it also means an omen. And I think this word in the Buddhist tradition is a rather archaic word, very significant in the context of meditation. It is during meditation that one might obtain certain nimittas. And these nimittas, in some sense, you could almost understand them as omens or as signs of one's progress. So I think that context of nimitta is actually rather important when we are reading Mahayana texts, whether they're sutras or shastras. The choice of the word nimitta should be understood also from that perspective. that it has something to do with nimittas in a meditative context. So this Animitta Yoga is a theme in Madhyamaka. It is mentioned by Nagarjuna, well, Animittam at least is mentioned by Nagarjuna in the Lokatita Stava, saying that basically without realizing Animitta, signless, there's not going to be any liberation. So Animitta, we can understand it as a keyword. Madhyamaka sometimes is described as Adarshana Yoga, the yoga of not seeing, Anupadamba Yoga, the yoga of non-perception or non-grasping, kind of. So there are several words which I think have slightly overlapping meaning used to describe the process of Madhyamaka practice. And now he explains the steps. Tatra pratamataha, so first of all, Hitubhuta, the one which is a cause of prajna, Shruta, Chinta, Bhavani, Mayi, which is Shruta Mayi, so it is the wisdom which consists or is elicited by listening. Chintamayi, the wisdom which is elicited by contemplation, and Bhavanamayi, by meditation, Kramena, so in due order. Abhyasat, Kramena Abhyasat, so due to being practiced step by step. Bhumi Pravishtasya Prajñām Nirvartayati. It is going to bring forth the wisdom of someone who has entered the bhumis. So in other words, someone who is still adimukti charita, who is still practicing on the basis of firm conviction, goes through the steps and at some point will obtain the wisdom of an Ācārya. Sacha aparapara bhumi pratilamba yogena prakarsham abhivardayanti yavat ubayavarana vigamat sakala kalpana jala vigata buddhatva svabhava prajñām nishpadayati. So, and that sacha, by obtaining higher and higher bhumis, aparapara bhumi pratilamba yogena prakarsham abhivardayanti, so increasing one's excellence, yavat ubayavarana vigamat, up to the removal of both types of avarana. So you see that this is one of the reasons I think this is connected to our initial verse. Up to the removal of both types of avarana, of both types of coverings, which is the kleshas, the mental afflictions, as well as the nyeyavarana, the blockages to what can be known. So when this is removed, what happens? Sakala kalpana jala vigata buddhatva svabhava prajñām nishpadayati. It brings forth the wisdom, prajñām, which has the nature, svabhava, of buddhatva, of Buddhahood, which is sakala kalpana jala vigata, which has all the net of concepts removed. And of course, this seems to be an echo of the famous verse of Dharmakirti, Viduta kalpana jala gambhiro dharamurtaye namasamanta bhadraya samanta spuranatvishe. Prajñākaramati certainly was very well familiar with Dharmakirti as well. So here you can see, I think, some useful keys to once again understand what is happening in our initial verse. I think in our initial verse, the idea that there is a process and the idea that there are different types of prajna, some of which are causes, some of which are results, is actually implied. So, for example, yam samyak pratipadya nirmaladiyo yanti uttamam nirvratim. Having perfectly engaged with it, practiced it, or understood it, pratipadya is a very rich word. Nirmaladiyaha, those with stainless minds, yanti uttamam nirvatim, they reach the best of nirvanas, which here must mean Buddhahood. And Nirmala Diya house, I think, is an indication of that. Stainless minds probably refers minds which do not have the two types of obscurations. This also, I think, is an echo of the Heart Sutra. Triyadva vyavastitaha sarva buddhaha prajñākaramitam ashritya anuttaram samyak sambodhim abhisambuddhaha. So all the Buddhas in the three times realize or awaken to the supreme perfect bodhi after relying on the Prajñākaramita. So I think that this also is probably echoed in this particular pada, another meaning of the same word, this quarter of a verse here. So I've not yet given the complete translation of the verse, and I see that maybe we don't have that much time. So let me go just through a general translation of the verse. The one who, being stainless, okay, nirlepataya actually means a little bit more literally, free from smearings, because lepa has more that sense of smearing something. Niruttarapadam, it is the pada, the state, maybe the station, which is niruttara, without anything which excels it. Also, it is sarva prapancha ujjita. It has abandoned all prapancha, or it is removed from all prapanchas. Prapancha means something like elaboration, even prolixity. It even has a slight sense of deception in some cases. It is anasrava. It is without fluxes. That's how I translate asrava, because these the main idea is something in flux, whether it is something which is flowing out of something, or it is flowing throughout samsara, or it is a kind of fermented product of fermentation. All of this is supposed to be included, and therefore just going to the barest element of the etymology, I go for fluxes. But this word is an important word because when something is anasrava, it can function as the path to liberation. So this is a point of abhidharma. If we engage with dharmas which have fluxes, what it means is that our mind will develop more and more mental afflictions, which are going to be somewhat latent. We are not going to be able to perceive it, but they will grow in our mind stream. If, on the other hand, we engage with dharmas which are free from fluxes, what it means is that even though we might have some mental afflictions now, even when we look at such dharmas, even when we think of Prajñākaramita, we might have some mental affliction, but they don't offer the basis for the mental afflictions to really increase, to stick and increase in our mind stream. Therefore, it is worth engaging with them, and they can function as the path. So when it is said that Prajñākaramita is anasrava, I think also it has something to do with the fact that it can function as part of the path.
About 10 minutes, Mattia.
Oh, 10 minutes, thank you. Ācārya, it is explained, or it is expressed through words which are samvriti words, so conventional or covering words, such as Prajñākaramita, perfection of wisdom, or rather we could say complete mastery of wisdom. Param ita, one of the etymologies would mean having reached the other shore, and this is a broader idea in Sanskrit. Shastra param gata means someone who has reached the other shore of a treatises or a branch of learning. So it is the idea of complete mastery. Yam samyak pratipadni nirmaladeo yanti uttamam nirvritim. That's, I think I explained earlier, but basically engaging with it in the right way, those who have stainless minds reach the supreme type of nirvana, the best type of nirvana, so we obtain Buddhahood. Tam natva vidivat. So again, here I think there is some reference to Chandrakirti, but we can take vidivat in two ways. We can take it going with natva, I think, or going with karomi vivratim. We can choose. And probably this is intended. I think it is intended. I will try to explain why. So having bowed or paid homage to her, to the Prajñākaramita, vidivat, so according to the proper manner, which could mean in this case two things. One is that the general idea that we need to have a Mangala Ācārya in order to follow the proper ways of learned people, and in order to remove obstacles for the accomplishment of our Shastra. But vidivat could also mean that I have paid homage in the proper way, as indicated, for example, in the second chapter of the Bodhicharyavatara, where we speak of Samyak Puja. Or if you take vidivat with what follows, then it means I am going to explain it. So, karomi vivratim, vidivat in the proper way, prasannehi padehi, in clear words or following Chandrakirti. If we say in the proper way, again, this could be an echo of something which is said by Chandrakirti himself. And now I will show you a verse from the Mangala Ācārya to Chandrakirti's commentary on the Mula Madhyamaka. Nagarjunaya pranipatya tasmai tatkarikanam vivratim karishya. So you see here we have vivratim karishya. Again, we have the word vivrati, which is, I think, intentionally echoed by Prajñākaramati. And then he says, Uttana satprakriya vakyanadha. So it is composed with vakyas, with sentences, which have got satprakriya. Now, satprakriya, I think, can mean two different things, at least two different things. There is a commentary, probably produced in Tibet, although it's a Sanskrit commentary, which understands it as being connected with the path that goes to Nirvana, which is the correct type of prayoga, in other words, the correct type of practice. But I think satprakriya can also mean good grammatical construction. I think that could also be one of the meanings. So I think that when we take vidivat going with the second part of the verse, we could take it as an echo of satprakriya as found in the verse of Chandrakirti. That is somewhat my guess. Now going back to the overall verse, maybe I cannot say much more. We don't have that much time, but one of the points I would like to raise as hopefully useful way of interpreting this verse and understanding its intention is bringing up the concept of Vajrapada. I do not know how many of you are familiar with this idea, but this is a rather important concept in the Mahayana. Most people, if they are familiar with secret Tantra, would have heard this, the Vajra words, but this is actually a general Mahayana idea. Vajrapadas are words, but their quality of being Vajra seems to be more connected with the state they represent, with their meaning, rather than with the words themselves. So they are Vajras, and this indestructible quality has something to do with not being destructible by the kleshas. So I think that this idea of Vajrapada, this ambivalence between a word or a key word and the state, which is going to be indestructible by the kleshas, is partly intended, or at least a very similar idea is intended in this verse by Prajñākaramati. In other words, when we engage with words in the proper manner, words become indestructible even by the type of coverings or flaws that it is their own nature to have. We could see it in another way, just like there are certain dharmas which, although are impermanent, make up for the path and will give a result which cannot be described as impermanent. In the same way, there are certain words, such as the words of the Madhyamaka treatises, that if one engages with them in the proper manner, will go beyond their limitations as words which are bound to elicit concepts, and instead they will become the causes and conditions to obtain Buddhatva, Buddhahood, which is described indeed as Sakala Vikalpa Jala Vigata, as having all its all concepts removed. So I think that this kind of fruitful ambivalence or ambiguity of the word pada, and which goes back even to how we understand it etymologically, as relating either to idea of fixity or to the idea of movement and understanding, is profitably used by Prajñākaramati to show how he is going to approach the task of explaining the Prajñāparamita, which is beyond explanation, and how generally to approach the study of Madhyamaka. So perhaps I should stop here. I think that we are about 50 minutes.
Yeah, just about. You're good.
Okay, but maybe now I could stop and we can see whether there are any questions.
Thank you, Mattia.
Thank you.
For that extremely rich discussion of this verse. I hope that our audience will not feel shy to ask any questions or clarification requests. You can write them in the chat or indicate that you have a question in the chat, or you can raise your hand in the under the reactions, and I'll try to call on people. Anybody have a question or a comment?
Hi, I had a question. You mentioned about this word nirvitam. I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it badly. Which you said was about without fluxes. Oh no, that's on Ācārya. You were talking about without fluxes.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. You were talking about without fluxes. And then you mentioned that dharmas that are without fluxes are kind of like reliable for practice. Oh, sorry. Please introduce yourself. Sorry, my name is Justin Howe. I'm a translation fellow at DRBU. Thank you for your time, by the way. But what I was wondering is, you said that these kinds of dharmas are reliable for practice, and it made me think of the Heart Sutra, which says like this Prajñākaramati is a great mantra, an unsurpassed mantra, and it can remove all suffering. Is there kind of like, is that sort of the meaning of those things, that this Prajñākaramati is without fluxes, that if you cultivate using it, it will inevitably lead to realization?
Yes, yeah, I think so. I think that that's a general idea, that even broader than the Prajñāparamita, this is a broader idea, that there are certain dharmas that are part of a path. And therefore, if we engage with those dharmas in a correct manner, those dharmas are bound to give a result which brings us beyond suffering, rather than perpetuating the cycle of suffering. When we look more specifically in the context of the Prajñāparamita, we have these slightly more sharper paradox, we could say, that we are talking about using concepts and perception in order to go beyond concepts and perception. So that's why we have a further level of paradox. But Madhyamaka masters might show that, well, this paradox is not so different, because there can be some asymmetry between the properties that are found in the path and the dharmas that make up the path, and the properties of the result. So not all the properties of the causes need to be carried on onto the result. So the concept of anasrava is a useful way to understand how that might work, because the point there is that, well, we have kleshas, and therefore our engagement with almost anything is likely to potentially be accompanied by kleshas. For example, we might think of the marga satya, the truth of the path, and dislike it, right? We could have a kind of dvesha towards it. But although that is possible, that truth of the path would still be called anasrava, because if we keep on engaging with it, the kleshas will not increase. They will not stick to our mind stream and increase. They will be bound to decrease. So this is how that kind of paradox is resolved in a simpler way, just in terms of how do we engage with something in a pure way, so to speak, so that it doesn't give us more suffering. And the point there is that it will not happen, in the sense that it's likely that we are going to have some kleshas, but if we engage with the right thing, then those kleshas will not stick, and eventually we will get rid of all the kleshas. So that's why this word, I think, becomes particularly useful if we remember this kind of abhidharmic reflection on what is sasrava and what is anasrava. That is the very beginning of the classification of the dharmas in the Abhidharma Kosha, for example. And this way we know what to take up and what to abandon. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question. James?
Hi there. My name is James Nguyen. I was, thank you actually for coming to our Shastra class. I appreciated that evening lecture that one time. I put my question in the comment, but I'll read it out here as well. I find it really interesting that, you know, this sort of ambiguity and double meaning of words, I mean, it sort of mirrors the very limitation yet necessary usage of words. It's kind of like this commentary is both commenting on it, and the very literary style of the text is actually trying to like do the very thing it's commenting about. It's like it's sort of doing, it's doing what it's saying and saying what it's doing, which I think there's something there that's I think a lot to sort of pull apart. Does the commentary go on to use style throughout this text, use language throughout the text in this kind of slippery style that, but also points in that given direction?
I think so. Well, there are at least some parts where that is done. Like, for example, the section on the example of the person with the eye disease was an illusion. And there are some places where you can see a slightly more literary element in the prose, and then this would come into play to some extent. There's several features that Prajñākaramati, I think, inherits from Chandrakirti regarding the ideal of writing prasannehi padehi with clear words. Actually, the word prasanna means well settled. So it's clear because just like water, when you don't disturb it, it doesn't have turbidity and it becomes perfectly transparent. And in Chandrakirti, this is contrasted to somebody else's style where he uses a lot of tarka. Tarka means, in that case, a kind of speculation or independent argument. While Chandrakirti does not offer so much independent argumentation when trying to explain emptiness, but rather showing the consequence of not accepting that something is empty. And overall, that makes for a slightly clearer prose in a sense, because it is slightly less burdened by certain technicalities, like presenting an hetu, drishtanta, so a logical ground, an example, etc. Like this also we can see is true of Prajñākaramati in the way he presents his arguments. He tries to maintain, I would say, a very clear prose. And I think this is meant to reflect certain features of the perfection of wisdom, certain features also of the dharma as understood by Prajñākaramati. Clarity. Clarity has, prasanna is sometimes almost a synonym of prabhasvara, of being luminous and clear. So maybe there is this feature of the style. Regarding ambiguity and ambivalence, I wanted to introduce this a little bit because I think this is a broader, more general feature of Sanskrit philosophical writing. Of course, this goes to a much higher level in the sutras, because if we read the Prajñāparamita sutras, they're full of kind of, we could say, wordplay, but in the sense that there are these fruitful ambiguities where certain paradoxes or contrasts are brought to relief very, very starkly. And so these two aspects, the aspect of employing ambiguity fruitfully, well, that aspect is common to Sanskrit writing in general. Like the idea that being able to convey more than one level of meaning is a good way of presenting one's thought. This, I think, is more broadly accepted by Sanskrit writers. Now we strive in formal academic writing for disambiguation. Ambiguity is not valued because the model of writing is taken from a different, from a completely different model, which I think maybe natural sciences, and it has to do more with numbers than with words, we could say. But the model in Sanskrit and also Pali is from grammar. And grammar is not just about disambiguation, but showing that there is more than one possibility in the meaning of words. In fact, the study of grammar, I think much of it has to do with showing how many meanings you can get by looking just at the same word. So I think that this is a more general case in Sanskrit and Pali. Then this, but the contrast, on the other hand, showing things as in sharp contrast and even with some element of paradox, that has more to do with Buddhist texts specifically and Mahayana texts especially. So you will not find it to the same degree, as far as I know, in non-Buddhist texts. It's actually something that I think Buddhist authors, even in poetry, use devices of that sort. It seems to be really an important part of a Buddhist tradition. I don't know if it answered your question.
No, that was very helpful and interesting. Sometimes, there's like clarity in clarity. Maybe sometimes there's clarity in being unclear and knowing which is which and what is what. But then there's the cultural elements and historical elements, but something to sit on sometime for me, at least.
Yeah, you could say that sometimes from the perspective of this text, the clearest thing that one can do is not to be particularly clear. So that I think is what comes up in the style more than once. If one were to try to represent the same ideas in a very diffuse manner by explaining step by step, sometimes that might not work as well. The main point might get lost in the process. So sometimes it seems, at least to me, that it is more effective.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Luke.
Hello, my name is Luke. I graduated from the MA program last year, and I'm just this year I'm just working as a staff. So I have this question. I was intrigued by your saying that certain dharmas are part of the path, and when correctly engaged, will lead to liberation.
Yes.
And I was wondering, is that dharma like the small d dharma or the capital D dharma? Because they kind of mean different things, and
Yes.
that can make this sentence itself have two different meanings, right? And if it's the small d dharma, then I think of the list for all the dharmas, right? I think of sound, and then this would be saying certain sounds are part of the path, and when we engage with that sound, will lead to liberation. I think of this as repeating a mantra, for example. You don't necessarily have to know the meaning of it. You just repeat that sound. So this is like the meaning implied by the small d dharma. But then the meaning implied by the big D dharma is like Buddha's teachings, right? And then engaging with the big D dharma, meaning you really have to think about it, think about the teaching conceptually somehow. And then this thinking about it will lead to liberation, right? So those two meanings seem quite different to me. And when you said that sentence, which sense are you referring to?
Well, actually, the two meanings kind of overlap, because when you look at the big D dharma, okay, what is the big D dharma? Is the collection of the 84,000 heaps of dharma. And what are they? These 84,000 heaps of dharmas either fall under samskaras, according to those who accept a certain categorization of dharmas, or they fall under rupa skanda because they're sounds. So it's not such a huge difference, I think. But primarily, I was thinking, you could say it in this way, I was thinking of those dharmas with a small d, which fall into the dharma with capital D. So which actually constitute teachings. Good example is in one sutra, when it is asked, what is the dharma? The answer is the Ācārya Ashtangika Marga, the path with the noble eightfold path. And if you see, that is mostly about engaging with certain dharmas with small d and avoiding certain other dharmas with small d. Yeah, Luke, I don't know if I answered you.
So the answer is the small d's that make up the big D.
Yes, yes. Although there is one instance, there is at least one instance where dharma is almost, like the dharma itself is almost understood as the dharmata, the nature of things. Prajñākaramati himself at one point explains it more in those lines. So that also exists. But that is more specific to, I think, Mahayana understanding. And it doesn't exclude that certain dharmas themselves are going to be part of a dharma in the sense of the teachings.
We have a couple more questions, and more coming in all the time. We have one question. Sorry, just give me a second to find it here. Dakina asks, Ajahn, what is the usage importance of using paradox? And I'm not sure. I think she must mean in this poem.
Okay. Well, it's kind of unavoidable. In paradox, usually we mean something that is going to appear to people as being counterintuitive. And it seems unavoidable in a context where one is trying to present things in terms of the two truths, and at the same time not present this distinction of two truths as being in itself an ultimate truth. So the paradox is unavoidable because one is presenting two truths, and at the same time the presentation of the two truths itself will always be done from the perspective of conventional truth by default, because it's a presentation. So it's rather than what is the importance, is more like it's kind of unavoidable. It's somewhat unavoidable, especially when we are in the context of sutras, and therefore arguments are not spelled out. In that case, there will be just statements which will appear self-contradictory. Like, I'm going to liberate infinite sattvas. And when I've done that, I have not liberated even one sattva. That is an example of a paradox found in the sutras. So in that case, the idea is that one should be wise enough to understand the sense in which one has done the liberation and the sense in which one has not done it at all. And at least one should be wise enough to understand that the two senses might not be exactly the same thing. Otherwise, it would be just a contradiction, a self-contradiction. But at the same time, if we diffuse the contradiction too much, there is also a risk to render everything too conventional. So this is the fine line, the slightly difficult part when there are presentations of the two truths, a presentation of appearance and emptiness, etc., etc. That in order to make them comprehensible, there is the need to explain them separately and slowly show how they might relate to each other. But the whole process is regarded to be somewhat artificial. So that's where these paradoxes come into play. Rather as something important, I would say as something unavoidable.
Dakina says, thank you very much. We have a question about, I believe it's about your choice of translation of the word flux. And
yes.
They would just like you to speak to a little more about that, your choice.
Is okay.
That right? Quinn? This is Quinn, I'm asking on her behalf.
Yes, my choice of fluxes is because the root from which the word ācārya comes from, through, has to do with flowing. And therefore, we found translations such as outflows, which is what I also employed earlier on. And it seems to be connected to the image of staining in some examples, and therefore you find that some would translate it as defilements. But the reason why I chose fluxes is because the A in āsrava is not interpreted in the same way, even by the same commentary when giving alternatives. So in some case, it can mean that they flow through the whole of samsara from this up to this. In another case, it means they flow out of certain dharmas, and this refers to the mental affliction. In another explanation, asrava is so called because this is a common word referring to fermented beverages that become intoxicant. And in that case, the whole idea of outflow, maybe it doesn't work. So I tried to circumscribe what is the common minimal element of meaning in all these different meanings. And I feel that this idea of fluxes is the barest minimum. And so I chose that.
Mattia, would you mind taking down your screen unless you need it so we can see you better? Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question, Sehan.
Yeah, hi, this is Sehan here. Hey, Mattia, love
Hello.
to see you again. Anyways, my question is, what do you think of the duplicity that comes when you use different words that are kind of associated with other or different concepts? For example, you know, when you mentioned that one word where you chose to translate it as covering, whereas you know, if I was translating, which would be far into the future, but you know, for example, I would use all encompassing, and there's also choice of stained. So all those would have different contexts associated with it. And you think all of those different words and different contexts brings like something into play here, where you would be using multiple concepts to kind of wrap your head around the fact that what you're kind of gunning towards is a liberation that is kind of beyond conceptualization?
Well, that works for some keywords, like let's say Prajñākaramati. So you can say Prajñākaramati, Advaya Jnana, Vipti. There are many words that one could use to indicate the state or the type of awareness associated with that word. In that case, your remark seems to be very pertinent. When you, however, refer to Samvriti, I think it's a slightly different case. Because the different etymologies of Samvriti seem to reflect its different functions. That seems to be the idea of these three etymologies. So when Samvriti is understood as covering, it is because it covers the real nature of things. When it is understood as mutual dependence, then one is not emphasizing the cognitive aspect, but one is emphasizing how things in general come into existence. And lastly, there is the idea of Samvriti being a kind of agreement between people regarding using certain words and meanings. And that meaning suggests that there is a conventional element in our communicative interactions. So depending on which word we're talking about, having multiple meanings and multiple possible analysis can have slightly different functions. In some cases, it can have the function that you have mentioned, but in some cases, it can be for slightly different purposes. And the common feature could be that when you have a keyword, the idea is that if it has many meanings, if it has the, that's a good thing, like to say it really in a very simple way. If you have a keyword, a key Buddhist word, it should have many meanings. Otherwise, there is something wrong. that is the difference compared to the way we are normally nowadays trained to present our ideas. That I think is the key difference. But then the reason why we are going to use this ambivalence can differ, and also depending on which system we're talking about, because not all systems value non-conceptual states. Some systems regard them as being poorer cognitive states. So for those systems, that kind of consideration will not apply, even if they will decide to use on occasion some ambiguities.
All right, thank you very much, Mattia.
Welcome.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes and we have a couple more questions. Sanju, I'm going to let you go ahead and ask your question. We will end the event after that, but Mattia's kindly offered to stay longer for anyone who wants to stay. And we have a few more questions, including a question about the background that you have. So we'll formally end the event after Sanju's question, and then anyone who wants to stay longer is welcome to. Sanju.
Hi, Mattia. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
So my question is that, you know, concepts, the idea of like words that go beyond concepts, it's really difficult to even like comprehend what that really means for a mind like mine, which is so used to reading words and trying to understand what's the concept behind it. So then when we are reading these texts, which are trying to arrive at this non-conceptual state, but using words to arrive at this non-conceptual state, what's the right attitude, or what's the way to approach this text? Because I noticed in your translation, you use the words such as perfectly paying homage, like proper manner. So it kind of seems to refer to like almost like there's a certain way for us to approach this text. And if we're not doing it proper way, as if we are missing the whole point. So is there a right, what's the right way? If not, what's the right attitude to have in order to approach these texts?
Yeah, well, the first point you made, I think we should clarify that these words are supposed to be able to go beyond words and therefore elicit non-conceptual awareness only through a process. So the non-conceptual state is regarded as being only the bhavana mayi prajñā, so the kind of wisdom which comes from meditation. It's not like straight away it's going to be something non-conceptual. But because they're going in the right direction of removing concepts, although we start recognizing them conceptually, then going through that process should bring us to this non-conceptual awareness. How to properly do it? The general idea in these texts that you can find repeated and becomes somewhat clearer if you see the whole of the Bodhicharyavatara is that one needs to accumulate, first of all, merit. So the accumulation of merit is the key point there. You can see that, for example, the other place, now we have Vidivat. I took it with Nattva, for example. If we take Vidivat, doing in the proper way, paying homage in the proper way, this you can see is quite similar to Tachittaratna Grahanaya Samyak Pujam Karumyesha Tathagatanam Saddharma Ratnasya Chanirmalasya Tadatmajanam Chagunodadinam. So the first verse of the second chapter, you can see that there is this word Samyak. Samyak means rightly, correctly. And this is taken in one of the meanings as I am going to do puja in the right way, or the other way is I'm going to take up bodhicitta in the right way. And Prajñākaramati himself explained what he means by the right way. It has something to do with having a good disposition of the mind. Again, there is these words like prasanna or abhiprasanna. The word prasada has to do with clarity, actually. But it's also translated sometimes as faith. So this is quite an interesting thing. It means a good disposition of the mind. So that seems to be a key point. Developing a positive disposition of the mind towards what one is engaging with. And of course, from the perspective of the Bodhicharyavatara, the key point is offered in the very first chapter, because the best possible disposition of the mind, according to the Bodhicharyavatara, is bodhicitta. The best way to accumulate merit is bodhicitta. So from the Madhyamaka perspective, actually, the real preparation towards non-conceptuality, paradoxically, is the accumulation of merit through bodhicitta. This is a point that maybe we might have difficulty relating to, but that is, I think, within the system, that non-conceptuality, the possibility to read certain words and being able to use them to go beyond words and beyond concepts, rather than using them to create more concepts, has a lot to do with one's own intention and one's own accumulation of merit. So that, I think, is maybe difficult to digest, but that's what they mean when we say samyak or vidivat, etc. Taking good care of the first two paramitas, so accumulation of merit, protecting the merit that has been, and avoidance of demerit, and then protecting the merit through kshanti as well. So yeah, that broader context, I think, comes into play.
Thank you so much. That's so wonderful. Thank you.
I'd like to invite everyone to give our great thank you to Mattia for sharing his wisdom and knowledge. This was such a joy to just open this door to us today. And anyone who needs to leave, you can leave and go off to your mundane lives, but the rest of us are going to stay and hear some more questions and answers. Thank you all very much for coming, and it's especially nice to see so many new faces. If you would like to hear news about DRBU or future events, you can sign up for our newsletter using this link. And we hope to see you at future events. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question about the virtual background. Someone is asking about what is
your background there. Yeah, what's going on there? Is that a virtual background? I almost feel like this is just what he has in his house. Yeah.
You're not the first person who thought that was my house. No, it's a painting of a pilgrimage to Wutai Shan, to the Panchashirsha. And you can see there are probably not exactly human beings going to Wutai Shan in this painting. So, yeah, that's all I know about this background, actually. I don't remember. I don't even know if I know who painted it, but I know that it is about Wutai Shan and the pilgrimage. Sorry, I don't have more information.
Sean, did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, Mattia, it went a little over, so it would have been a nice closing question, but for those who are here, I was just, it's a tricky verse to make sense of, and the discussion has actually helped clarify a lot of the beauty of the verse, this sort of play on covering and uncovering and multiple meanings and somehow uncovering the real non-conceptual meaning behind the conventional form. But so maybe it's something along those lines, but I was wondering if you could sort of distill what you see as the wisdom of this verse in your own words for us.
Oh, you mean like an overall meaning of a verse?
Yeah, or some salient insight that it offers us or distills in, its play between form and meaning. And as you see it, yeah, what's the beauty and the wisdom in this verse for you?
Well, for me, the most striking point is this ambivalence of words. So the idea that somewhat even a certain choice of style can help go beyond the words more easily. I think that is a striking thing about this verse. Maybe that is one of the things it introduces. I was trying to get to what I think is the key point by mentioning this idea of Vajrapada. These words, which are words, but at the same time are presented as key words whose meaning is going to be unaffected by any flaws or kleshas. And beyond the details of what each of the lines of the verse says, I think that a very similar idea comes through this verse. So if I had to say it very briefly, that would be, that would be it. There's a lot more, of course, going on, because the emphasis of not having prapancha. So prapancha is, again, that is a key point of Madhyamaka. Prapancha has to do with speaking. So that is also an interesting thing. That and again, very difficult word to translate, because prapancha, we can translate, I usually use elaboration. I think there are other ways. It has even been translated as hypostatization, I think, which I think brings it to a rather far away context. But this word has to do with speaking, and at the same time, that is only an image. So when we are talking about words, that is one of the points that perhaps didn't come through, that the words are just a kind of image, in the sense that the main point is conceptualization, not words. And conceptualization is something more fundamental and more subtle than what we end up putting into words. I think that this is we should keep it in mind when reading Buddhist philosophy in general, but especially Madhyamaka. So the other part, which I think is important for this particular verse, is that it emphasizes the process, that there is a process in order to obtain these high non-conceptual states, such as finally Buddhahood. And this, to me, is particularly useful because there is a recurrent misunderstanding, in my opinion, that Madhyamaka has nothing to do with meditation, for example. That is purely a conceptual process, and you just go through that conceptual analysis, and that's it. That's all what Madhyamaka is. And even rather prominent scholars seem to present it in this way. And I think that's really misguided. I think a verse such as this, if we read just a little bit between the lines, not even very much, clearly is presenting the chapter, the 9th chapter, as part of a broader process and as part of the cultivation of the 6 perfections, shamatha and vipassana. And yes, eventually there is this idea that one goes beyond concepts. All of these were concepts, but it's not immediate. It's not like once you've been told that it's just a concept, that's it, that's the end of Madhyamaka. In a way, that's barely the starting point of Madhyamaka. And this, I think, of all the possible ways to misunderstand Madhyamaka, in my opinion, that is one of the worst. because then we are running in the opposite direction. Like this verse, and also when we look at it from the perspective of some other passages of Prajñākaramati, somehow clarifies that there is a process, there are things that we have to do in order to slowly become more familiar with non-conceptual states, understanding the difference between the two truths, etc., etc. So it's also a kind of warning that just reading it and thinking that we come to some kind of philosophical conclusion, then we jump to some other paragraph of some other philosophical writer, and we keep on doing that, that could very well be going in completely the opposite direction. That was the early point about Vidivat or Samyak, etc., etc. There is some kind of Vidi, in other words, there is some kind of krama, there is some kind of method, there is some kind of upaya as well. And the upaya is not simply, okay, read the Madhyamaka text and just try to fix the argument. Today we introduced Madhyamaka without actually going into any of the Madhyamaka arguments per se, strictly speaking. And this was somewhat intentional, because while the arguments are of course very useful, but to think that that's the whole of Madhyamaka, that once you have clarified what is the argumentative structure of a passage, you have understood what Madhyamaka is about, I think that's not the case. And this is where verses like this one can be useful.
Thank you, Mattia. I'm wondering how you're feeling. We have one more question here.
That's fine, sure.
Okay, go ahead. Hitomi?
Hi, Mattia.
Hello.
My name is Hitomi. I'm a friend of Sehan's, and I have a question, but I'd like to preface that I have zero background on this subject, and I've recently been introduced to it. My question is, you mentioned that transliterally nirvana means liberation, but in Buddhism, is it understood as a state of being or rather a figurative place? This is referring to the piece of text that says, those with stainless wisdom reach the supreme nirvana. What I understood is that this implies that there are different stages of nirvana. Can you help me understand?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's because in this system, one can obtain 3 types of nirvana. One is the nirvana of the hearers, which are those disciples who hear the dharma from somebody else and then practice it and then go beyond suffering. So nirvana means that there is no more suffering, basically. There is no mental affliction, there is no more suffering, there is no more rebirth. The second type of nirvana is of Pratyeka Buddhas, which means those who do not get teaching from others because it's not available at that time in this world, but through the power of our own meditation, thanks to prior training, are able to obtain the same type of liberation from samsara. That means no more suffering, no more rebirth, no more mental afflictions. The third type of nirvana is that which is obtained by the Buddhas, by the complete Buddhas. And that does not constitute only liberation from suffering, but also the highest type of awareness that one might have, meaning that they are omniscient in the broadest possible sense, and therefore they have the ability to turn the wheel of dharma. They have the ability to establish the dharma in a particular world. So these are the 3 types. Now, in that verse, I believe it is referring to this third type because of the word uttama. So they obtain, it is by relying on the perfection of wisdom that the Buddhas obtain Buddhahood. That's why the perfection of wisdom is also called the mother of the Buddhas. Jina Janani, the one who gives birth to the victors, is the perfection of wisdom. Yeah, but there was another part to your question, whether it's a state of being or a kind of place. It's the freedom from any mental defect. Just to understand it simply, when there is no mental flaws whatsoever, that is what is meant.
Okay, yeah, that was very concise. Thank you.
Okay.
Can I piggyback a follow-up question on that? Since Hitomi asked about the Nibbana word, I was also curious about it. I noticed that in the text it was nirvriti. Is there some sort of wordplay there between all the, samvriti as conventional language or covering language, vivriti versus as the disclosure or the uncovering, and then the word for nirvana is nirvriti. So
yeah, that's what exactly.
Okay.
That was one of the points that I wanted to make. Nirvriti, freedom from vritti. I think we can understand this kind of word. So no kind of avarana anymore. Although at a more conventional level, the word nirvriti, it seems to me, is used almost as a substitute for the word nirvana, despite the difference in etymology. So we find words like parinirvrata, instead of parinirvana, we can find parinirvrati, etc., etc. But in this case, I think it is very intentional that we have samvriti, nirvriti, and vivriti. I think so.
So there's another wordplay and sort of signaling at the possibility of uncovering by covering.
Yes, yes. But by using word, one uses words not anymore as samvriti, but uses them also as vivriti. The paradox is that one of the ways to use words as vivriti rather than samvriti is to show that words are samvriti. That is the kind of paradox.
Dr. Mattia, I have a question, and it might be a dumb question, but I've been told that dumb questions are important. So let me ask you. I've been struggling with the idea of the path, which is when you say that there is a method, there's a vidivat, so there's a vidi, there's a method to it. And when I think of something like Tao Te Ching, I know, and the first verse goes, the way that can be laid out, the way that can be walked is not the way. And maybe the way I'm reading this is very literally. So then sometimes I'm just like wondering when we say the path, it doesn't seem to be very clear exactly what the path is, but still there's some method that you said, there is a method you have to follow. Now this is just something I'm struggling with personally, is that when we think there's a method, I tend to wonder where exactly I'm in that path. Is it linear? And then I start thinking conceptually, is it circular? Is it linear? Am I here? Am I there? And then, so then there's two things, which is like, there's a path, there's a certain method. And there's also, even if there's a method, there's no way you can walk, or like the way that can be walked is not the way. How do you reconcile these ideas, or what is the right way of thinking about these things?
Okay, the Tao Te Ching, okay, is the Tao Te Ching, so it's a different thing, but there is a similar idea in the Buddhist text. The way that this is reconciled in the Mahayana text is that one applies wisdom to the other parameters. And that means that, for example, when one practices dana paramita, one does the process called trikoti parishuddhi, the purification of the three spheres or the three limits, which means one practices with the awareness that there is nothing to give, there's nobody who's giving, there is no recipient. So that is where you get both the path and the awareness that the path which is spoken is not the real path. That is actually the meeting point of those two ideas. Regarding now whether it's linear, nor linear, etc., generally it is, I think, regarded to be slightly different for each person. That's why even the texts which describe the bhumis, we explain that actually these levels are infinite. But these are kind of guidelines which offer certain ideas of how the various bhumis might work. Although for most of us, thinking of the subdivisions of the bhumis is not an immediate concern, because if one is on the first bhumi, they can have hundreds of thousands of nirmanas, and they can live for a whole kalpa. So unless we are in that situation, maybe we don't have to worry about that. But the overall path is actually, the Bodhicharya Avatar is a good text to have an idea of what the overall path is. How to engage with the path practically is a more difficult point, because actually, if one wants to do it seriously, normally one should have engagement with a teacher. That is generally believed to be the case. You can see these in the Prajñākaramati sutras themselves. The story of the Bodhisattva Sadaprarudita going to meet his teacher, what he does just to meet the teacher, how much emphasis is given generally in the Buddhist text to Kalyana Mitra, which is normally the word used. And there are texts specifically explaining how one finds or chooses a teacher, etc., etc. So for those who are very much engaged, especially with the shamatha, vipassana, the stages of meditation, etc., the simple point is that we normally cannot see the back of our own head. And therefore, there are cases where someone who has certain abilities, or at least sufficient kindness, should be able to say, well, you know you're doing this wrong. That's why it's really not working and you're stuck. So that is that's one consideration, that probably it's very difficult if one does everything on one's own not to feel at some point rather lost. Like, oh, what am I supposed to emphasize? How does this work? What really am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to spend lots of hours meditating, or am I supposed to do something else? It's quite difficult on one's own. The basic point, though, the more basic point that is really easy, I mean, accessible, at least one can say, is that you can see most texts emphasize a lot meditating on death. And therefore trying to develop a very sincere wish to be free from samsara. That seems to be something that, in my understanding, the idea is that if one develops that very sincerely, then all the other steps come almost naturally. But that part is really difficult. I mean, I discovered it's even difficult to talk about it. I once went somewhere and talked about it, and then I got someone sending me an email. You should never speak about these things. People are going to have all sorts of psychological problems. Yeah, maybe, but it's possible. But to me, it looks like if somebody doesn't know that they're going to die, they have a psychological problem. I can't think of a bigger one. So that's unfortunately, sometimes it's not always easy to just understand the emphasis. I mean this, without really too much engagement with a living tradition, when we read the text, we might think that certain parts are not so important, that there are some parts of the text that we can kind of, we read them, but okay, I read it quickly, then I get to the main point. Oh, now there is the discussion of whether something arises from itself or something else. That's really the only important part. The other parts, yes, I read them, I did my duty, but actually, when we sometimes see how the texts are used in the living tradition, we might have some surprises. My teacher's teacher was famous for giving teachings on the Bodhicharyavatara every year. Like he would spend time in retreat, then go out of retreat and teach to all the monks and nuns the Bodhicharyavatara. And he taught all the chapters, except the 9th. Interesting. So, you see, when this is the thing, that the things that look easier sometimes might be, in practical terms, the things that are more determinant for one's own personal practice. Because, and it's actually a very simple thing. If one cannot relate, for example, to realizing the inevitability of death, then the idea that one has realized emptiness from the perspective of the traditional Madhyamaka is laughable, because those are just different levels of the same exact realization in a way. The realization of death is the realization of a very coarse level of impermanence. And the realization of impermanence is the realization of a coarse level of emptiness. So if one cannot realize the coarser levels, if one cannot have any kind of personal relationship with these more coarse levels, then how is it going to work in terms of, oh, I got the argument, that means I understood, I'm on the 3rd bhumi? Probably not. And maybe some of the things that are said about what bodhisattvas on the bhumis do or can do should be taken a little bit more seriously as a warning. You think you're on the bhumis? Okay, how many bodies can you emit? How long can you live? You can't do it? Don't be too sure. So I do not know if I've answered you in a comprehensible manner, but I hope I understood your question clearly.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was very enlightening. It was almost, I don't know, the answer, maybe the question wasn't really looking for an answer, more like a clarity. So that was really helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, I think that we should let Mattia rest or go on for the rest of his day, because actually this is his morning and he's given us his morning and now he has the whole rest of the day to do. So thank you all for staying. I always feel like Mattia probably could have started to give us a whole nother lecture. We'll have to have him back for another lecture on the Bodhisattva path. And
so maybe I should mention that I think samikshas are here. If you want to ask more questions on Madhyamaka, you can do it on Sunday. We have a meeting organized by Samiksha and Samiksha. Some of you are in touch with at least one of the Samikshas, so you can ask them. They are the organizers. So that's just for questions. So if you have more questions, Samikshas are the door to more questions.
do you have a link for that? Or I think I have it somewhere. Should I look? Did you share that link with me, Mattia? I feel like
I think maybe I did.
Yeah, let's see. Let me look for it here. What would be the key word? A non-Sanskrit word? Something special about that.
The keyword would be samiksha, I think.
Okay, tell me how to spell that.
Yeah. Oh, I sent it only to Sean, sorry.
Oh,
Wait,
he doesn't need to, he knows what you're talking about.
Samiksha. Yes.
Samicha. I'm not, oh, there it is, okay. Okay. Link. No matches.
Oh,
Maybe because there's, I don't know. Let's see. I'll just look up your name and see if I can find it.
okay, let me see if I can find it.
I have so many emails.
But I don't know about the timing, whether it works well. It's in the
5
evening.
a.m. in California.
Yeah, it's not good timing. That's true.
Yeah. Who
Yeah,
asked
people
for
get
it?
up here very early. The ones that attend morning ceremony are up at 4.
Yeah.
Okay, then some can do it. Where is it?
Yeah. Sorry, I have so many
I
emails.
think I found it.
Okay.
I think I found it. Let me send you the link.
And also, Mattia, if anyone from around here, you have other questions that pop into your mind, you can send them to the symposium team and we will forward them on to Mattia. And that email.
Also, is it the same one as the one with Vidya? No, different one. That's only chanting. This is a Q&A on Madhyamaka. It's actually a series on Yogacara and Madhyamaka, and they will alternate between Yogacara and Madhyamaka with different speakers. So on Sunday will be the person being interrogated, and then the next time somebody else, and it will go on in this way. So unfortunately for your timing, yeah, it's not really ideal. But they will also, it will be recorded as well. And so at some point you could also just write questions on the recording, like on the link where the recording is. That's also one way. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, you can find him on.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're going to end here.
Thank you very much.
I have one quick logistic question to ask you, Mattia, if you wouldn't mind staying back, and Lauren and Sean's going to stay with us. But thank you everyone else for coming. We hope that we'll see you again